I woke up strapped to a soft table, staring at what looked like the cast of a nature documentary gone horribly wrong, like someone gave the narrator a fistful of psychedelics and told him to wing it. Last thing I remembered was a clean shot through my left side during a recon op on Zeta V. Good shot, clean exit. Not even the worst Saturday I've had. I blacked out behind a blown-out HAB unit trying to call in evac before my comms fried from the EMP wave. Woke up in a glowing blue room with walls that pulsed like a jellyfish's lungs, and a voice whispering in my ear like it was trying to talk me down from a ledge.
Sergeant Mason Briggs of Terran Corps, you are safe. You are no longer required to fight.
They kept the lights dim, like a spa for the criminally insane. Everything smelled like lemon and salt water. The air was thick, humid, and oddly warm, probably comforting for my new overlords, who looked like a squid had mated with a therapist and walked out of a Zen garden. One of them, tall, with limbs like flowing kelp, slithered closer, did that tentacle paws thing they do when they're trying to look non-threatening. It looked like a nervous jazz hands routine.
I am Sub-Advisor Keth. You are within the Rehabilitation Center of the Zarnathi Imperium. Your species displays extraordinary destructive tendencies. We intend to help you find equilibrium.
I blinked at him, so I'm in rehab for being human. Ket's eyes, all 6 of them, blinked, a synchronous.
In a manner of speaking, you have been removed from conflict. That is your first step toward peace.
They thought this was helping. They thought this was going to fix me. It was adorable, really. Over the next few days, they tried everything. Meditation pools with floating aroma crystals, holographic peace gardens where birds chirped in 5-tone scales designed to reduce cortisol levels. They even made me watch soothing ocean documentaries with whispered narration in my native tongue. What they didn't realize is that kind of quiet, that stillness, it kills people like me. I'm a Terran Marine. We don't shut down. We don't switch off. We get twitchy when it's too quiet. Peace makes us nervous. You put me in a room designed to keep me calm, I'm going to start planning how to break it. So I did. It started simple, push-ups in the middle of the night. They had cameras on me 24/7, so I made sure they saw it. Slow, controlled movements, shirt off, back muscles glisten in the humidity. Psychological warfare, 2 can play at that game. On day 4, I did sprints between the nutrient dispensers and the holosuite door, 15 laps before they begged me to stop because it was disrupting the emotional balance of the facility. On day 5, I asked for a jump rope and a sandbag. They gave me a holographic simulation of a jump rope, programmable tension and everything, and I smiled like they'd just handed me a loaded rifle. By day 7, one of the guards, a younger, jittery Zarnathi with a limp tentacle and a name I couldn't pronounce, started trying to mimic my warm-up stretches from the observation post. I pretended not to notice. By day 10, he was joining me for 4 o'clock PT. His name, or at least the one I gave him, was Steve. Steve was the first crack in the shell. They started calling me the anomaly, not because I was dangerous, though I was, and they damn well knew it, but because instead of breaking down, I was getting stronger, literally. Whatever they fed me was probably designed to maintain baseline health for a sedentary creature. For me, it was clean, efficient fuel. I turned it into muscle mass and aggression. Every time they recalibrated my emotional stabilization schedule, I threw it off by getting calmer. Every time they tried to reprogram my behavior loops, I built a new one they couldn't predict. They thought they had me in a cage. Truth was, I had them in a classroom. By the end of week 2, 4 of the staff were shadowing my morning routines. I told them it was breath-centered kinetic resistance training. They nodded like it made perfect sense and started referring to it in the reports. Week 3, I held a workshop. No, I'm not kidding. It started when Steve asked if I'd instruct his pod mates in the Terran methods of psychomuscular resilience, which I assume meant, can you teach my friends how to do push-ups without screaming in pain? So I ran a damn class. 10 Zarnathi in a row, wiggling and stretching like wet noodles while I barked counts and talked about discipline through discomfort. Somewhere around the part where I shouted, pain is weakness leaving the body, one of the senior analysts had a full-blown panic attack. They tried to shut me down again after that, tighter restrictions, less freedom, and the goddamn ocean documentaries came back full force. But it was too late. The seed was planted. I wasn't their subject anymore. I was their instructor. and class was just getting started. By the start of week 4, they'd stopped calling me subject and started calling me sergeant. I didn't ask them to. Hell, I tried telling them once that it was just a rank, not a name, but Steve insisted it was a title of spiritual significance among warrior castes. I figured, screw it. I've been called worse. The rehabilitation center staff still thought I was a psychological threat, of course. That hadn't changed. But now it came with this weird kind of reverence, like they'd trapped a god of war in a glass box and were afraid to poke it too hard. I'd catch glimpses of senior analysts peeking through observation slits with portable neurofield monitors, probably trying to figure out what made me tick. Good luck with that. I don't even know what makes me tick. All I know is if I'm breathing, we're doing PT. That's when the morning drills got structured. It started with a whiteboard. I asked for one under the pretense of expressive self-therapy. They gave it to me because the phrase hit all the right notes in their little emotional playbook. I used it to write out daily routines. 4 o'clock, wake up. 4:10, breathing drills, combat pacing, 3 sets. 4:30, core circuit. 5:15, resistance calisthenics, tentacle variant. 6 o'clock, motivational, affirmations, yelling. They didn't question it. By the second day of the whiteboard, I had 5 Zarnathi showing up voluntarily. They were awful at it, not because they weren't trying, but because their bodies weren't designed for the kind of punishment I live for. Still, they pushed through it, shaking and gasping through high-rep sets of what I generously called modified burpees. I told them it was all part of the sacred Terran warrior ritual, embrace the suck. Is the suck a form of mental toxin? One asked me, his voice echoing through his vocal siphon. Nah, I said, grinning like the devil. It's the part where everything hurts and nothing makes sense, but you keep going anyway. They ate it up. The guards stopped standing watch and started asking for personalized nutrition diets. The food processors adjusted their nutrient profiles to include post-ritual amino shakes. One of the psychologists built a whole presentation on the adaptive psychophysical bonding rituals of human military culture, citing my squad PT as a case study. I made a joke once about giving them all dog tags and ranks. Steve showed up the next day with a bent piece of alloy around his neck and private stuff scratched into it. They started calling themselves my unit. Around that time, the Zarnathi administrators tried to put the brakes on it. Keth, my original squid shrink, requested a private session. The room was dark, backlit by bioluminescent streams pulsing through the walls, ambient lighting designed to promote introspection. Ket's posture was stiff. His tendrils were coiled like springs.
I am concerned,
He said, voice low.
Your influence is shifting the emotional landscape of this facility.
I leaned back in my chair, crossed my arms. You mean people are less anxious, more focused, and pushing their physical limits in controlled, goal-oriented environments? He blinked, all 6 eyes fluttering.
Yes, precisely.
Sounds like progress to me. Keth made a low, warbling sound, the Zarnathi equivalent of a sigh.
We are not meant to train aggression, Sergeant Briggs. We are meant to neutralize it.
And what if aggression is the only thing keeping you alive when diplomacy fails? I asked him. What if the universe isn't some big group therapy session, but a boot on your throat, and all you've got is the muscle to push back? He didn't answer, just stared at me like I was the final stage of some terminal illness. After that talk, they downgraded my schedule, took away my whiteboard, pulled 3 of the trainees off active participation, and reassigned them to meditative recovery. So I did what any good NCO would do. I ran PT anyway, right in the middle of the corridor outside the meditation pods. 4 o'clock sharp. I blasted old Terran cadence tracks through the facility PA system. I had Steve leading stretches, and another squid I'd nicknamed Toothy counted off reps with a gurgling bark that made him sound like a dying garbage disposal. They couldn't stop it because here's the thing they never understood. I wasn't infecting the Zarnathi with aggression. I was giving them purpose. Then came the parade. No, seriously, Steve and his little squad surprised me one morning by organizing a structured honor march. They'd cobbled together makeshift armor using repurposed therapy pads and food tray plating. Someone had even painted a Terran Corps insignia onto their chests. By the end of the week, I wasn't in rehab, I was in command. Word must have gotten out beyond the aquarium because soon I had visitors. Not guards, not researchers, diplomats. A trio of high-caste Zarnathi advisors swept in like they owned the place. Flowing robes, ceremonial fins polished to a shine, smelling like some kind of herbal sea incense. They walked into the training area mid-squat cycle and nearly fainted at the sight of 6 of their kind grunting and sweating under my barked commands. The lead one, this smug purple bastard with gold-lined suckers, leaned in close and said,
"This is deeply concerning. You have warped these beings into imitations of your own chaos."
I leaned in closer. "No, I forged them." He bristled.
"You've turned a psychological sanctuary into a barracks."
That night, Steve brought me a broken neural pad. He'd carved 3 words into it. "We are ready." I didn't know what they were ready for yet, but something told me the galaxy was about to find out. You ever run a squad drill with 12 bioluminescent cephalopods in a corridor designed for silent meditation? It's like herding glow-in-the-dark pool noodles that scream encouragement at each other. We were 3 weeks into the unofficial boot camp when I realized something had shifted. This wasn't just physical therapy anymore. This wasn't just a handful of confused aliens trying to mimic a Terran's weird habits. This was unit cohesion. They'd started talking to each other like soldiers, using the call signs I gave them, speaking in clipped reports, even debriefing after every drill. They weren't playing soldier, they were soldiers. And I'll be honest, it scared the hell out of me. Because for the first time since Zeta V, I saw it, the look in their eyes, that hard glint, the tight, deliberate posture, the hunger for purpose. That's not something you teach. That's something you wake up. The next few days blurred together in a haze of drills, tests, and tactical briefings I snuck into their neuro feeds. I had them watching old Terran combat footage, urban warfare, jungle ops, zero-G boarding missions. I narrated every clip like it was a bedtime story from hell. They lapped it up. Steve started running fire team formations down the corridor, complete with hand signals I made up just to mess with him. Toothy developed his own version of a breach and clear technique using his 3 strongest limbs and what I can only describe as an aggressive wet slap. One of the quieter ones, call sign Echo, started building simulation scenarios on the facility's hologrid. We were running live ops by week's end. It wasn't long before I got called back in for a consultation. Same room, same bioluminescent glow, same Keth, only this time he looked tired. "There is a growing movement within the staff," he said, each word slower than usual.
"They believe you have instilled pride, even identity."
"And that's bad?" I asked.
"For Zarnathi?" He made a mournful sound. "We do not identify with war. We outsource it. We transcend it."
"Tell that to Steve. He's working on squad formations for orbital drop pods. Better to bleed together in training than to die alone in denial." Now, here's where things get fun. Around the 6-week mark, one of Echo's drills went live, not by accident. We were mid-run on a hostage extraction sim. Holograms, foam weapons, real tactics. When the lights in the facility flickered, the holograms shorted out. For a second, I thought it was just a power surge. Then the alarm kicked in. It was not a test, not a drill, a real goddamn breach. I hadn't heard that sound since my last combat drop, the kind that pierces through your bones and flips every instinct to kill mode. The squad froze, half crouched, half mid-roll. I didn't even think. "Prep for contact, defensive pattern Bravo." And the crazy thing, they moved, just like that. We'd never practiced for a real breach, never trained with weapons that did more than sting. But these little squids were ready. They snapped into cover, stacked by the main entry, eyes alert, bodies coiled. A tech drone zipped past the corridor at full speed, clearly not ours. Ugly, boxy, with heat blooms on its undercarriage. Recon unit, probably from the Okerel, the only bastards ballsy enough to infiltrate a Zarnathi core system. And then it hit me. The war wasn't just out there anymore, it was here. The breach turned out to be a deep recon incursion. No casualties, no combat, but it rattled the Imperium hard. The Zarnathi had spent centuries convincing themselves they were untouchable, shielded by treaties, proxies, and the illusion of being too annoying to conquer. Turns out the Okerel weren't interested in politics. They were interested in territory, resources, expansion, and they were moving fast. Over the next 2 days, everything changed. Diplomats stopped showing up. Analysts went dark. The facility AI restricted access to civilian channels. Even Keth stopped doing his check-ins. I knew the signs. The Zarnathi weren't planning a response. They were preparing to surrender. That night, Steve came to my room. No fanfare. Just stood in the doorway, twitching slightly.
We're being transferred.
To where?
Central Imperium. Higher clearance facilities, away from conflict vectors.
I sat up. They're pulling you out of the fight?
There's no fight to be had.
He said, voice flat.
Our policy is containment and deferral. We avoid confrontation at all costs.
And what about everything we trained for? He didn't answer, but I saw in the subtle way he clenched his limbs and the way his breathing sped up just slightly, he wanted to fight. The next morning, I called them all in, the whole squad. 17 Zarnathi crammed into the training atrium, silent, staring at me like I was the high priest of some forbidden cult. I'm not going to lie to you, I said, pacing. The Imperium's scared. They're pulling back. Maybe they're hoping someone else will deal with the Ocarel. Maybe they think diplomacy still works. I stopped and looked each of them in the eyes. But you know better. You've trained. You've bled. You've sweated through every minute of this with me. You know what's coming. You stand and you fight, not for glory, not for revenge, for each other, because no one else will. Steve stepped forward, slow and deliberate.
We will not be approved for offensive deployment.
Then screw approval, I said. You've got brains, tech, and the kind of resolve they don't even understand. We don't need permission. Duthie slapped the floor hard.
Then what do we need?
I looked at them all and smiled. Gear up. I always figured if the end of the world came, I'd be in a trench with my boots sunk deep in the dirt, a rifle in my hands, and a squad of good men watching my six. Instead, I stood barefoot on a therapy platform surrounded by sentient squid, staring at a holographic war map stitched together by bioluminescent cephalopods who once tried to deprogram me with soft music and scented sand. The Okrell weren't teasing anymore. 3 colonies had gone dark in 6 days, not conquered, erased. Orbital bombardment followed by drone deployments to scour the surface. No hails, no terms, no theatrics, just clinical extermination. The Zarnathi High Advisory Council issued a press release that could have doubled as a suicide note. They expressed deep concern and reiterated their commitment to interspecies harmony, as if the Okra would be moved by pacifist poetry and cautious optimism. It was a damn mess, and everyone with a brain knew it, including the higher-ups running this place, because they suddenly announced a full evacuation of the rehabilitation center. The senior analysts were the first to be loaded into shuttles. Staff, researchers, a few high-priority techs, even the therapy dolphins from Hydro Wing, but they hadn't allocated enough transport for the rest. Steve and his squad were being left behind, tucked away under the excuse of non-critical personnel.
They expect us to wait here until the next wave?
Steve asked me, disbelief warbling through his voice. I didn't answer. I just watched the last shuttle leave the platform, rising into the clouds with a humming silence that sounded far too much like surrender. The second that shuttle cleared atmosphere, I activated lockdown protocols. They had abandoned us, and with that decision, forfeited any right to control what came next. Echo hacked into the facility's infrastructure and secured access to every door, drone, and subsystem. Steve and Toothy broke open the emergency storage lockers and pulled out anything resembling a defense mechanism, from non-lethal shock sticks to expired combat med kits. We stripped down old therapy bots and reprogrammed them into mobile turrets, even if they looked like malfunctioning octopi with bad attitudes. The med bay became an armory, the sensory garden turned into a shooting range, the holographic pools, live fire sims. Within 2 days, the place no longer resembled a recovery ward. It looked like a forward operations base, waiting to be tested by the real thing. And we didn't have long to wait. The enemy fleet arrived ahead of schedule, barely 36 hours after the shuttles left orbit. 4 dropships broke through the atmosphere on low trajectory vectors, surrounded by drone screens and atmospheric scouts. The planetary grid didn't fire a shot. Whatever defense systems the Imperium had out there either weren't active or had been bypassed. They were coming in clean. The outer perimeter picked up seismic activity around 3 o'clock, heavier signatures, more directed movement than their recon drones had shown in the first wave. That was our window. Toothy tripped the demolition charges on the outpost ridge, rerouting them to redirect the Ocarel drones into a narrow corridor laced with our newly reprogrammed turret units. Once inside the kill zone, we opened fire with handcrafted pulse weapons that Echo had barely finished calibrating. It was chaos, beautiful, blistering chaos. The Ocarel were fast, but they relied on predictability. Once the opening tactic failed, they hesitated. That gave us the margin we needed. Steve's squad pushed forward with suppression volleys while Echo updated targeting paths in real time, guiding the team like a conductor leading a battlefield symphony. The first wave broke against our defenses like a tidal surge against a jagged reef. Unfortunately, they learned fast. The second wave carried heavier armor, smarter drone protocols, and pulse jammers. They came through the southern maintenance corridor, breaching 3 layers of shielding and frying one of our power grids. We lost 2 good soldiers from Delta Team, Sarisha and Vel. Both had been with us since the first week of drills. No hesitation, no complaints, total resilience that gave way to absolute fury when things went sideways. I gave the fallback order to regroup at Point Sigma, the inner courtyard reinforced with thermal plating and a shielded command station. That's where we'd placed our last card, an ancient terraforming core we'd jury-rigged into a kinetic launch weapon. A relic built for soil compression and weather manipulation, but with the right adjustments, it could launch a makeshift rod of steel into orbit with enough force to pop open a cruiser like a soda can. When the first Okara gunship cleared the canopy above the courtyard, we fired. The blast flash-fried half our grid, knocked every one of us to the ground, and blew a crater in the eastern wall, but it also cut that ship in half and sent the rest of their aero units scrambling back into the sky. We'd landed a proper punch, and now they knew this wasn't some passive outpost full of fragile academics. This was a stronghold, and we were dug in. It didn't stop them, of course. The Ocarel don't fold after one loss, but what it did do was disrupt their pattern. For the first time, they pulled back. They regrouped. And in that lull, something shifted in my unit. Steve wasn't asking for orders, he was giving them. Echo was proactively rerouting power, shifting defensive lines based on probability calculations I hadn't even considered. Toothy had created a specialized breaching countermeasure team made up of the most physically capable in the squad, a personal project he'd never even mentioned to me. They were doing it, functioning like a team, moving like soldiers, fighting like they'd been born into this. I wasn't leading a makeshift defense anymore. I was commanding a battle-hardened platoon. We held through 2 more attack runs before the Ocarel pulled out completely, retreating to low orbit and leaving behind a mess of shattered drones and slagged hulls. It wasn't a victory, not in the grand sense. We hadn't stopped the invasion, we hadn't turned the tide, but we hadn't folded. We had proven something the Zarnathi couldn't, that resistance was possible, that the Ocarel could be bloodied, that survival wasn't about isolation, but unity through shared purpose. And that purpose didn't come from philosophical clarity or peaceful ideology. It came from struggle, from commitment, from pain willingly endured and strength earned through fire. Steve planted a makeshift flag at the crater's edge, a scorched banner of heat shield cloth, marked with the jagged emblem the squad had adopted as our own. It fluttered, torn and soot-covered against the pale morning sky, a symbol of defiance, of rebirth and war. Later that day, we received a transmission from Zarnathi High Command. They didn't offer congratulations, just questions. They wanted details, statistics, methodology. How had we trained? What tactics had we employed? What kind of equipment had we improvised? I gave them one answer. We followed the doctrine of the Terran Corps. There was a long pause, then a follow-up. Would you be willing to instruct others? They were forming a new command division, something they never imagined they'd need. A defense branch, hybrid in nature, built around the idea that maybe, just maybe, there was something to learn from the humans they once tried to pacify. I told them yes, not because I wanted to be their hero, but because I'd seen what Steve and the others had become. They weren't anomalies anymore. They were soldiers, and they were ready for the next war. The shuttle that picked us up for the strike didn't exactly inspire confidence. A retrofitted medical transport with hastily bolted-on armor plating, and a dorsal cannon that looked like someone welded it on during a panic attack. The hull was still painted with the soft blue swirls of the Zarnathi Health Division, but underneath the scrubbed-out insignia, someone had scrawled 3 Terran words in shaky stencil font: Hales Hab units. It wasn't regulation, it wasn't subtle, and it sure as hell wasn't pretty, but to us, it felt like a battle standard, a recognition that the Imperium, at least some part of it, finally understood what we were about to do. This wasn't a negotiation, it was a warning. 2 weeks after we repelled the Okerel at the rehab facility, they came back, not with another fleet, but with an offer. The Zarnathi High Council had quietly authorized a classified offensive program. They didn't advertise it, just coordinates, objectives, and a list of units they wanted involved. Our squad, the Misfits of Rehabilitation Facility 14A, was at the top of the list. The target was a fortified supply station on an Okerel-controlled border moon. Intelligence suggested it served as a staging ground for their planetary campaigns, a critical node that funneled supplies, weapons, and bioclone reserves toward the front lines. Most of the Zarnathi military minds wanted to avoid a direct engagement. They preferred hit-and-run tactics, limited exposure, fallback doctrines. But we weren't Zarnathi military minds, we were Terran trained. The mission was simple, at least on paper: infiltrate the moon's surface, sabotage the uplink array controlling their logistics network, and disable, or preferably destroy, the armory buried beneath the central compound. If all went according to plan, it would set their eastern assault back by months. We hit dirt during a storm, sulfur winds whipping across the jagged plains, visibility down to a handful of meters. Perfect cover. The old Corel didn't have a clue we were there until the uplink dish exploded, courtesy of Echo's remote spike planted just inside their defensive perimeter. From that point on, subtlety went out the airlock. The old Corel reacted fast, faster than we'd anticipated. Within minutes, our cover was compromised and the battle turned into a brawl across trenches of scorched rock and broken steel. But this time, we weren't defending a facility, we were on the offensive. And my squad, they were magnificent. Steve coordinated the forward team with a calm intensity that reminded me of field officers twice his age. His fire team breached through a bottleneck canyon using improvised pulse scatter grenades to clear drone formations that would overrun any other unit. Echo maintained full-spectrum battlefield awareness from an exposed perch, rerouting power, disabling turrets, and issuing precision adjustments with the kind of cool efficiency that would make an AI blush. Toothy, in what had become a tradition, charged through the breach point with a shock baton in one limb and a chunk of enemy armor strapped to his back, laughing in that wet, gargling growl that we'd come to know meant he was having a great time. Watching them, I realized something strange. I wasn't leading them anymore. I was just running to keep up. We pushed through the outer compound and hit the armory within 30 minutes of boots down. The munitions cache was bigger than we'd expected, deep, reinforced, and stocked with materials powerful enough to crater a continent. There was no way we were leaving that place intact. We planted the charges, set a remote detonation protocol, and began our exfil. And that's when the Okerel sent in their real response. The counterattack came in the form of heavily armored shock troops supported by crawler mount railguns. These weren't scout drones or base defense units. This was a real combat group, flesh and steel, bound by organic command links and an intent to wipe us off the face of the moon. We fell back to the southern access ridge where the land sloped into a narrow, jagged funnel, the only terrain that gave us any kind of advantage. The charges needed 3 more minutes to reach full armament. We had to hold. For 3 minutes, we fought like maniacs. Toothy was everywhere, darting from cover to cover, cracking Okerel armor with point-blank shock strikes, pulling wounded squad mates out of fire and returning twice as hard. Steve held the flank, steady and brutal, moving with the kind of control that made it easy to forget he used to tremble during cooldown stretches. Echo, bleeding from a limb I hadn't even known could bleed, rerouted the comms grid so I could call out targets with perfect clarity. When the timer hit 0, I triggered the detonation and signaled evac. The armory erupted beneath us like a dying star. A thunderclap ripped through the sky as the shockwave rolled over the terrain, lifting rock, fire, and Okerel bodies into a roiling, incandescent bloom. The heat nearly melted the plating on our shuttle, and for a moment I thought we weren't going to make it off the ground. But the thrusters caught, and we soared clear of the blast, rising above a hellscape we'd carved with our own hands. From orbit, the facility was just a glowing wound. Mission accomplished. When we returned to Zarnathi space, we weren't treated like anomalies. We were hailed as soldiers. They debriefed us, dissected every second of the footage, and parsed each movement as though we were specimens of some rare apex predator species. We were offered commendations, new ranks, and strategic advisory roles. I accepted, but only under one condition: we wouldn't be the last. The Imperium had made a mistake, and they knew it now. Not the mistake of capturing me, but the mistake of trying to change me, of believing that the human will to fight was a sickness, a defect, instead of what it truly was, a strength, a gift, a survival instinct wrapped in stubborn pride and sharp edges. What they once feared, they now sought to understand. And what we had built in a rehab facility with no weapons and no permission was now the cornerstone of a new military doctrine, a hybrid strike force initiative, where discipline met adaptability and where the willingness to suffer was a weapon, not a weakness. Steve was promoted to field commander and now trains platoons across 3 sectors. Echo leads infiltration and tech warfare operations. His simulations are already reshaping Imperium tactics. Toothy, somehow, is both a war hero and a public speaker, though his speeches mostly involve threats and poorly timed jokes about using someone's spine as a jump rope. As for me, they gave me a desk. I flipped it. I still wake up at 4 o'clock sharp, still run drills, still shout motivational slogans that make alien dignitaries question their life choices. And every time a new recruit asks why we do things the Terran way, why we train until our limbs ache, why we fight through exhaustion, why we lean into pain with eyes wide open, I tell them the truth. Because one day, the enemy's going to come through that door again. And when they do, I want to be ready